I am going to take a look at a Caro Con line tonight, followed by 3 games, so we can get started immediately. This Caro Con line is the line that happens. It's called the Botvinnik Karl's defense, but basically d4, d5, e5, and then c5 by black. On the e5 advance, this is the second most common play for black. Basically, bishop to f5 is the most common play. That's what you see the most frequently with the immediate Caro-Kann advance. But the second most common is c5. So now there's a number of options for white. The most popular is d takes c5. Also playable knight f3, c3, knight e2. Knight e2 and c4. So basically, this is a large set of options. I think in terms of looking at the eval, is probably the first place to go when choosing an option. But I think we should take a look at the most popular line first. This seems to be about 7 times more popular than anything else. D takes c5, and yeah, let's look at it. So what's interesting here is that the d takes c5 is not the most highly rated line on the eval. The most highly rated line on the eval is knight to f3. That is interesting. I'm sort of, when I look at this position, I sort of wonder in terms of pawn takes c5 on the eval. One of the big themes in the French is maintaining this d4 e5 pawn structure. I get the sense that in the Caro-Kann that's not as important, largely because this bishop has, the ability to be on the outside of the pawn chain. So it's not as if that maintaining this e6 pawn is going to be extremely valuable to white. So undermining the pawn chain, doesn't improve black's light squared bishop in the same way in the Caro-Kann as it does in the French. So d takes c5. And then with d takes c5 having been played, black has, again, 2 options, knight to c6 and e6. Good question. Which one do you think is better here? I guess I would say probably knight to c6. You're making this play for this e5 pawn immediately. Your hope is that you can probably clear out one of these 2 pawns. I think knight to c6 should be better, with the idea that on a move that defends this e5 pawn, like knight to f3, black can then play e6, and white cannot play b4 to defend the pawn on c5. If played immediately like this, this pawn is getting attacked, but b4 can be played. b4 usually isn't played. That tends to be overextension for white, but still, with that said, it ends up being a situation where where basically white equalizes. So white takes, and then top option, knight to c6, bishop to b5, e6, bishop b3, knight e7, and basically black's facing off against white here. White has an extra pawn. Basically, this pawn on c5 is still there. It's not getting clipped immediately. This pawn by e5 is also pinned by this bishop. This knight can't take this pawn. So, it's really going to come down to how well white can, develop around the loss of these pawns and how much effort white wants to put into defending these pawns. If it becomes too cumbersome to defend these pawns, this pawn on c5 and this pawn on e5, then white just won't do it. So that's one of the main things. Sorry, excuse me. So that's one of the main things about this is basically this, is this defensive e5 and c5 worth it, and is it disruptive to white's other positional concepts to continue that defense? c3, bishop d7, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, knight f3, and then here white's up by about, 0.2 pawns. This pawn is very weak, but white has allocated the bishop to e3 in order to defend it. This pawn is also fairly weak, but we'll see kind of in the main line how this ends up equalizing. Hey, welcome, Amet. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Knight to f5. Hey, how are you, Alexandre? Thank you very much for joining. We were taking a look at Caro-Kann with this advanced c5 line. I was trying to think maybe we could get some master games from this. But yeah, basically I was looking at the different options here. There's a couple of splits. D takes c5 is the most important. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining, Smiggy. Appreciate you joining the stream. You're always it's always appreciated if you're here. That I guess that shows commitment to be up that late. But yeah, so here pawn takes c5, and then two options: knight to c6 or e6. But pawn to take c5 is a pretty well established, main line for white out of this. So black has the options knight to c6 or e6, knight to c6, bishop to b5, pinning this knight and pushing towards the king. E6, bishop to e3. And basically, bishop to e3 is played in order to defend this this pawn on c5. So this line, this bishop to b5 line, a very common line. Basically the defense is attempted to be maintained on these pawns. Even though it is difficult to maintain these pawns, white goes through the effort of developing pieces to squares where they successfully maintain c5 and e5. So basically, these pawns aren't as lost as they potentially could be. You basically defend them with knight to f3 and bishop to b4 for the e5 pawn, and with bishop to e3 for the c5 pawn. But that's the plan for white. The plan for white in this Caro-Kann advance is to take on c5 and then work to defend the pawns. At some point, you do have to kind of pull away from that general idea. Let's take a look in the main line. But bishop to b5, e6, bishop to e3, knight to e7, and basically this this pawn is basically not getting attacked anymore. If black plays b6, pawn takes b6, white is very happy with that trade. So trading that c5 pawn is definitely a good opportunity for white in any case. Here, main line c3. Bishop to d7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now b4 will provide a defensive option for white if he wants. Bishop to d4 is very interesting. This is the second most common move. Well, no, the thing about the Caro-Kann is I don't actually see c5 that frequently. I play the mainline Caro-Kann. I don't play the French advance. So people requested the lesson of Caro-Kann with advance. But I split from this theory around move or on move 3. I play knight to c3. Just so we know, and just so everyone knows, I think this might be helpful. This is like one of the few things that I actually advocate memorizing because it's not super intuitive. But yeah, this is the mainline Caro-Kann, knight to c3, and then you can memorize it pretty easily out to move 10 if we go through this twice. Basically. Pawn takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5, knight to g3, bishop to g6, h4, h6, knight to f3, knight to d7, h5, bishop h7, bishop d3, bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. This is worth memorizing too, I think. It's 10 moves. It's particularly easy to memorize because you remember that the queen takes the bishop on d3 on move 10. But this is like one of the few lines where I'm actually like, you should probably just memorize this for the sake of memorizing it, just because it's not particularly intuitive and it's the main line in a relatively common opening. So d4, d5, knight to c3, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop to f5, knight to g3, bishop to g6, h4, h6, knight to f3, knight to d7, h5, bishop to h7, bishop to d3, bishop takes, queen takes. Worth memorizing, just so everyone knows. That's the main line of the Caro-Kann. That is the most, that is the most common one. So white is better there, and basically, this is white's position playing Caro-Kann as white. Anyways, that is the main line. So I don't play e5. I play knight to c3, just so we know. So yeah, e5. c5, and now the book. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew the main line. But the book line response to this Caro-Kann advance on c5 is pawn takes c5, and then options of knight to c6 and e6. Two ways of pushing against this. Pawn here, or basically pushing against these pawns here, and maintaining defense on these pawns is a big thing. So yeah, knight to c6 or e6, choices for black. Knight to c6, early push to bishop to b5, e6, and then ideas of bishop to e3, knight to f3, and potentially queen to g4 even can be played for white. Queen to g4 looks like a pretty interesting line. I can't imagine that's very good, but yeah, this looks ultra aggressive for white, and it's basically enough to give black a small lead, even though it's the second most common opening line. So here, bishop to e3 defends the c5 pawn, and knight to f3 defends the e5 pawn. I think that's a good idea. I think that will hold up pretty well. And yeah, defenses on these pawns I think are a good plan for white. Black's main moves here are knight to e7. Uh, uh, that's weird. Did this break the engine? That's really strange. Look. Hey, look, this is actually looks like the engine is broken, or the opening book is broken on this one. That's pretty interesting. Um, it has two splits between knight ge7 and knight e7. I've never seen it do that before, actually. That's actually pretty interesting. That's an interesting glitch there. Knight to e7 has 330 games, and knight to g7 has 240 games. Like, it's treating those as if there are two different moves is what I'm saying. Isn't that weird? I've never seen that. I've never actually seen it do that before. So that's interesting. Anyways, that split is surprising. So knight, if you want to move your knight to e7, then pick the first option, and if you want to move your knight to e7, then pick the second option. Both good options. So that's the main line. These two moves here. That is really unusual. I've never seen the opening book do that before. Anyways, knight to e7, c3, bishop to d7, and basically here, yeah, isn't that weird? I've never seen that happen before. Interesting. So bishop to d7, bishop takes c6 is pretty good for white. But basically white's theme in this opening is to trade the pawn. Like, we're looking for general themes and ways that white can play this. White should trade the pawns first, and then he should maintain defense on these pawns, into relatively late in the opening. There haven't been any options really for black to, or for white to neglect holding on to these pawns. So I think basically just here, white is fine. Ideas could emerge like b4, a4, b5, but white's going to be fine here. He has one pawn to give back, somewhat fractured pawn structure, but he's going to try to not give either of the pawns back. A4, b4, and b5 can be played for white. Main line, knight to f5, bishop to d4. Bishop to d4 is the most common main line. Let's take this probably to like move 12 to 15. I just want to see what the full main line here is. Queen takes, again defending both of these pawns. The defense of these pawns is pretty rigid by white. It's not one of those situations where white basically gives back one of the pawns, easily. White holds on to these and makes legitimate attempts to make sure that they don't actually get lost. b4, b6, c takes b6. So that solves that problem. Basically, that isolated c5 pawn is now traded off for the b6 pawn, so that's good for white. A takes b6, castles, bishop e7, knight d2, castles, rook fc1, bishop to b5. And basically here, I think white's good. I mean, this, white's up a pawn, and the weak pawn is probably c3. c3 and e5 are the weakest points in this position. e5 can't actually really be undermined that easily, but c3 can get lined up against by some powerful pieces. So that's something to consider. Anyways, bishop to b5, queen e3, rook fc8, knight to d4, bishop to d7, and white's pretty. I mean, I guess I would say white's pretty comfortable here. This is played into a early middle game where white still has the initiative. Why not pawn takes? Good question. Do you mean why not pawn takes here on knight takes d4? Why not pawn takes? Good question. I like the question. Let's do some analysis of that question, because I don't know the answer. I can see what the main line is. The main line is by far queen takes d4, but c takes d4 makes intuitive sense to me too. That seems to hold on to both of these pawns pretty well. But great question. Yeah, always feel free to ask questions. I'm always super happy to go over them. So yeah, b6, and then on c takes b6, queen takes b6, and then white may castle. But probably should castle. So basically here, white castles, and then queen takes b2, and then knight to d2. Okay, so that's one line. So this is the first line: queen takes, knight to b2, and then basically white has given back the pawn that he was up, and now has two knights to two bishops. So that potentially could be good for black there. So on c takes b6, pawn takes b6, a takes b6. This is interesting. So white, or sorry, let's go back to the split. Pawn takes b4. Yeah, I think that's right, but you're asking a good question, so I really want to go over the analysis fully on that. We've gone over the main line, but yeah, I'm actually really curious. So b6 is the move for black. If a5, then white is given a positive eval, and that works out perfectly. Given basically an error, white castle's fine, and then nothing can get into that d4 square. But yeah, it gives white tons of activity. So d4, or pawn takes d4, b6, pawn takes b6, queen takes b6, and then I'm wondering about non-castling moves here. Or like moves that potentially defend the b2 pawn. Like I'm thinking like queen to b2. How does black play against that? So queen to b2, rook to b8, and then I'm just going to keep looking for moves that don't lose pieces. So b3 runs into bishop b4, knight to c3, bishop to b5, and bishop to b5 is played as a resource to keep white from castling kingside, which he really needs to do pretty badly here. So yeah, let's just go through this just so we get the full main line. So pawn takes is pretty much a solid main line here. The first point of split is when black plays c5 in the Caro-Kann, what do? And the main line is very clearly pawn takes c5, and yeah, I mean after pawn takes c5, white is still up, maintaining a reasonable advantage. The engine seems to prefer other moves like straightforward developing moves like c3, but I don't know. The main line is pawn takes c5. It's possible that the engine doesn't fully understand this position. It's also possible that the theory is antiquated. But that said, I think it's probably pretty safe to play the mainline theory here, which is pawn takes c5. It's responsible for about 80% of the moves, so that's what I would go with. Pawn takes c5, e6, and then white's options here. So e6, basically, with e6, you can play bishop e3 immediately. But the main line here is knight to c6, bishop to b5, pinning the knight and protecting the e5 pawn. But the main concept of white in this situation is to maintain defense on both the c5 and e5 pawns. You're up a pawn, but it's not a situation where you want to give back a pawn, because if you give back a pawn, black has good activity in this situation. So you want to basically keep the pawns on the board, not lose them, and then see if you can trade them off for either trade off your isolated pawns for black's pawns, but don't give them back because black will get a lot of play on the queen side. So anyways, here going through the main line, which is pretty well established, e6, bishop to e3. Then there's this weird split of knight e7, which I've never seen before. That is very strange in my mind. But say knight ge7, c3, bishop to d7, bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight to f3. Basically here, white's up by about 0.3 pawns. I think this is good for white. Knight f5, and basically, white is comfortably defending all, his pawns. There hasn't been a successful attempt by black to remove his pawns. You play bishop to d4, maintaining maintenance here. A5 is worse. A5 basically, with A5, white just castles and no problems there. But I think that bishop to d4, pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4. Which server, Limestone? Where are you playing? Where are you at 1400? So yeah, pawn on d4, defending c5 and e5. Cool. Yeah. No. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, my recommendation is tactics. If you do lots and lots of tactical study, you'll improve. But I think that's your fastest route to improvement. But there's many routes to improvement. So I'm happy to see if I can do anything to help you here on this stream. So yeah, pawn takes d4, and black gets a lot of play. We sort of showed how how white couldn't maintain b2 after playing pawn takes b4. I'm not sure how bad that is necessarily. Like, I'm pretty sure queen takes b2, knight to d2 is not really a disaster for white. It's just not very good. So here basically this knight defends on d4, and white, it's unclear who's winning here. Black is given an eval advantage of 0.2, but yeah, white and white has the inferior minor pieces. But overall, I don't dislike white's position. I don't dislike white's position that much. Having this pawn structure's reasonably good for white. With good tactical play, white can make some chances to try to generate play on the queen side here. I mean, I don't know. It's all just practice, to be honest, Limestone. If you do puzzle battle for 6 hours a day for a month, I mean, it's pretty clear that it's going to improve. So it's mostly about how much time you're interested in putting in. So that's what I would recommend. Limestone is go with a lot of tactical study. But yeah, that low blitz rating. I think fast tactics. So if you have a premium membership, I would think Puzzle Battle. Puzzle Battle is also really fun. I really like Puzzle Battle. I think there's one called Tactics Racer or something on Lee Chess. But it's up to you. But I think those really fast race tactics might be very helpful for you. Just to get your blitz up a little, at least a little bit. That's my thinking on that. But yeah, so anyways, the main line here is queen takes, because after pawn takes b6, queen b6, and then white ends up in a slightly worse position where black has two bishops and the material is equal, but with the pawn on d4. So with this main line queen d4, white is still showing slightly better. Queen to c7, queen to a5, a5 are all options for black. Let's say queen to c7 here. Queen to c7, because queen to a5 lets b4 in. Let's see what the engine says is the best. Engine says queen to c7 is the best. Yeah, I just looking at it, I think queen to c7 is probably the best for black here. b4 defends this pawn. White's making very good, successful defenses of c5 and e5. b6, pawn takes b6, a takes b6, castles. And I think white's equal or slightly better here, maybe. Maybe knight to d2, knight to b3, rook to e1. White is comfortable. Is the main point. This is a slightly better situation in which than the one in which material had been equalized, but all of the queen side had been liquidated. So bishop to e7, b knight d2, and white again is still equal here. Castles. So yeah, so this is the main line. Let's just go through this. This is main line number one. Main line number one, there was a big split to do with 3 e6 or 3 knight c6. Four e6 or 4 knight e6. But this is the knight to c6 main line. So on this Caro-Kann, we've decided that pawn takes c5 is the best. The knight to c6 is played. This is one of two main lines. So there's two main lines here. Knight to c6 is one, e6 is the other. We'll go over e6 in a second. But we're looking at the knight c6 main line out of the advanced Caro-Kann. Knight to c6, bishop to b5, e6, bishop b3, knight to e7. The thematic concept is that white is defending the c5 pawn and the e5 pawn. He's not giving them back. c3, bishop d7, bishop takes, knight f3, knight f5, bishop to d4. And on knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen c7, b4, and all the pawns are defended. And it's about equals. So I guess what I would say about this is, I don't know how much that is to memorize, but the thematic... So I think you could probably memorize that if you make the effort, just as the main line out of c5 advanced Caro-Kann with knight to c6. This is probably a situation where, you're 12 moves in, but the theory kind of makes sense, so it's not impossibly hard to memorize here. So I guess I would say, memorize it if you can. But if not, then just remember the basic concept in that knight to c6 line. I think probably in the e6 line too. The main thematic concept to white is to actually hold on to these pawns for as long as possible. And he actually has a reasonable chance of doing that. If he trades off the pawns, he's going to end up with superior or inferior minor pieces. That's going to be annoying to play against. But yeah, that c5 e5 defense is basically what white is playing there, and that'll overall that should end up being good for white if he maintains the defense, or at least trade into a slightly better game. So that's the main line out of knight to c. Let's go the other direction. E6. On e6, the defense is slightly different. Because that pin, that to b5 pinning knight c6 pin was such a key part of the defense of or basically such a key part of that play by white. Like knight to c6, bishop to b5 is a given. Here you don't have the same ability to pin the knight. So so what should white do? I guess I would say probably bishop to e3. Let's look at what the eval says. Eval does not support that. Eval's going for knight to d2, which isn't really even on the list of possible moves. The engine's having a lot of trouble with this situation, which is kind of interesting. So yeah, e6, bishop to e3, knight to h6, c3, and basically white is fine. White's maybe slightly better. c3, this bishop is defending the e5 or the c5 pawn, and then I think basically white's going to have kind of the same general strategy: defend these pawns, keep everything fine, and no problems. So knight to f5, bishop to d4, bishop to d7. I don't know why white wouldn't take knight takes d4 if he's willing to take in the other line. Here, I guess c takes d4, and there's not the same issues. Let's say b6, c6, right. And that's that's a key difference in this position. C takes b6 is worse for white. So remember, we're basically comparing two lines. Knight to c6 after so d takes c5, knight to c6, bishop to b5, e6, and basically we're just going to play through the main line here. The bishop trades on c6, and then bishop d5 and queen takes d5. Okay. So that we found to basically be, in this case, we found queen takes d5 to be, basically determined to be better for white than pawn takes d4. Queen takes d4 better than pawn takes d4 because after b6, the center d5 pawn gets overmined, has to trade, and then the queen threatens on b2. But here, if we take this the other direction, so basically, like if we look at 4e6. Here, we're with bishop to e3, knight to h6, basically defending this. Black has kind of the same choice here, right? This is the main line out of e6, or e6, bishop e3. And in this case, the knight has the option to take the bishop, but he doesn't do it. First, he doesn't do it in the main line. But then the second point about that, after knight takes d4, here the correct play is c takes d4 and not queen takes d4, because there's a big difference on b6. White can play c6 because there's no piece on c6. In the other main line that we were looking at, there was a bishop on c6 that was preventing that pawn from moving forward. But here, white just plays c6, and then on knight takes c6, basically white maintains a small positional advantage. Materially, but there's not really any great way for black to make any progress on the queen side. Bishop e5 and knight to c3 basically is a good developing square for that knight. Knight to f3 is good, but basically this is a relatively equal game, and things are interesting here. So that's my thought. That's basically what I was going with, and I think that that having that e6 on move 4 as opposed to knight to c6 on move 4 leads to a difference where basically white has c6 as a tactical resource and ends up with a favorable French pawn structure, which is really what this is at this point. This is just a good French pawn structure. White will develop normally and play, both sides will probably play versions of the French. Weird versions of the French, one which this knight on g8 is gone. But yeah, this would be fine for white. So those are the two main lines. Let's take a look. These go on a little bit further. They're going in kind of the early middle game. Ideas for white. White's going to play it similarly to the French, probably. He's going to seize this long diagonal if he can. A6, bishop d3, b5. And now I think probably white's best chance is to start attacking on the queen side. Or sorry, attacking on the king side. Pawn structure is not symmetrical. This e-pawn faces off against this d5 and e6 pawns. Black has better center control, but white has a good long diagonal here for the bishop and a good long file here for the rook. So, I don't know. Very interesting situation. So yeah, as our recap, those are the two main lines. C5, and then by far the most popular choice is pawn takes c5. I'm going to advocate pawn takes c5 as being white's response to this. You can just make this a default. It's the main line. It's played in a very high percentage of cases. So I think you can safely play pawn takes c5, not worry too much about it. Okay, so the two options here, knight to c6, e6, about equally likely. Knight to c6, bishop to b5, e6, bishop to e3. This e3 pawn is defending against this, defending this pawn on c5. In both of these openings, basically, the idea initially, at least, is to defend the pawns on c5 and e5. It's not one where you immediately give back the pawn that you've, that black has, given you. You basically hold on to that, the c5 square and the e5 square. The main advantage of that e6 line was that, the knight takes d4 wasn't particularly playable because c6 could be played as a resource, basically going to a square white. But yeah, that is the main concept in both the knight to c6 and e6 lines. The default play for white should be to defend c5 and e5. Yeah, so g7, f4 is in this book. Let's look. Let's see what the eval thinks. But yeah, f4 is number 5 here, and then black is a little bit worse. Sorry, black is a little bit better. White's a little bit worse. Knight to f5. The issue with an immediate f4 is that this bishop can get this knight can play f5 with tempo, threatening the bishop. That may not be a problem, but it's not ideal. I don't know. So, yeah, d takes c5 is better. And then black has the options of either knight to c6 or e6. On e6, bishop to e3, I think, is the second most common move. Let's look at the a3 line. So the theme is, in the lines that I've shown so far, it's been very straightforward that... but yeah, f4 is definitely a play, but it comes in later in the middle game. You have to really watch the tactics surrounding f4, but conceptually, yes, I think f4 to support the isolated e5 pawn could be a good move at a later point in the game. Not early, but it could be a resource that could be helpful. It's a pretty broad answer, but yeah, I think holding on to those pawns is valuable. If you can tactically get away with f4, if it doesn't cause black to have some, pretty monstrous tactic, it looks playable to me. If you could play f4, g4, f5, I mean, it's again very situationally specific. But good question. The answer is it varies based on position. So yeah, bishop to e3 holds on to this pawn. This is thematically fitting along with that pawn takes c5 against the advanced Caro-Kann. So I think it's valuable to keep that in mind. Bishop e3 defending c5. But the real change here, the real the line that we haven't looked at so far is one where basically white offers this this c5 pawn. This is a little bit different. Here basically white's making a different play. So the play before was hold on to the pawns, because if the pawns are removed, it's going to lead to a better position for black. So like equal material equals better for black because black has better piece play. A3, which is the main line here, and it is more popular than bishop to. It's about split main line first second with bishop to e3. A3 takes a different approach. A3 is basically saying, okay, well, this pawn is pretty much lost. It's very dislocated on c5. So I'm going to give black the opportunity to actually take it here. And I'm going to play for an advantage in this way, trying to get an advantage with piece play on the board with, with the material returned to black. This is an interesting play. This eval looks a good amount worse for black, or worse for white, to be honest. Like, black is up by 0.36. So I think that that's not the right play. I think the thematic play is bishop to e3. After bishop to e3, we look through all those lines, say like knight to d7 or knight to d7, sure. Or sorry, excuse me. So this knight on d7 is basically the response for black. But the theme behind this opening is this bishop to e3 defending against c5. And here, with that in mind, white is better. So my point is, after bishop to e3, white has an eval that's plus 0.15. If white plays instead pawn takes e6, and then the options here for white are a3, knight to c6. Knight to c6 is one of the lines, but bishop takes c5, b4. This leads to an advantage for black of about 2/10 of a pawn. So black goes to like bishop to b6, I think is the main line. But black is showing slightly better here, I think, or at least it was a second ago. Also, I guess fairly close to equal. But say white is, white can play g4, I guess, queen g4. But anyways, this advantage line, this one where you actually give back the pawn as white, I view as being objectively worse than the line where you tried to hold on to the pawn with white with bishop to e3. So those are the two options here. Number one most popular is a3. Number two most popular is bishop to e3. But I think bishop to e3 fits in thematically. I think, having gone through these openings, I guess what I would say is whether whether black plays 4 e6 or 4 knight c6. White's main thematic play is to defend the pieces, on e5 or c5. That's the thought here. That's, I think, what's helpful. And I think that's the best idea for white. Knight to h6, c3, knight to f5. This defends that pawn. And then bishop to d4. In this case, on knight takes d4, you take with the pawn. Having this c6 resource available for white is helpful. b6 and c6. Then knight c6, and white has basically this still this intact French pawn structure, and we'll make developing moves around it. So, anyways, that's what I would say there. So I don't know. In terms of playing, so in terms of practical play against this, first pawn takes c6, then option of 4 knight to c6 or 4 e6. It's up to black what to play, but basically one of those two moves. Either way, I think your main thematic strategy against that is to spend at least a little bit of effort trying to defend these pawns. Black may undermine them. There may be tactics from black. We saw the main lines go through it, but yeah, here hold on to c5 and hold on to e5 if you can. So knight to h6, c3, knight to f5, bishop to d4, bishop to d7. This is a line where the knight doesn't take on d4. This was instead the main line. Basically here on move 7, there's an option between black playing bishop to d7 or black playing knight takes d4. But it's up to, it's basically up to black what to play. So let's try the bishop to d7 line. On the bishop to d7 line, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to d3, knight takes d4, pawn takes. And white's pretty comfortable. This is a very playable situation. What is worth noting is that b6 can be dangerous for white. But yeah, I think overall after b6, pawn takes b6, white is comfortable. No issues, and yeah, white has a solid position. He's up a pawn, but black is going to undermine with b6 and try to win the pawn. Basically, try to win the b2 pawn or the d4 pawn. Let's see what happens on b6. I assume this is the main line. On b6, there's two options for white. Let's look at. I mean, c takes b6 seem to have slightly better practical results, but overall, this situation looks pretty good for black. So where did we break off here, basically? Bishop to d3 could be helpful. C takes. This looks like mainline stuff. So black seems to be better out of these lines. A3, A5, bishop b2, bishop b7. And yeah, I mean, I guess in this position, white's looking more comfortable. Where was the split, though? Bishop to d3, as opposed to bishop to d3, queen to d2. See if that eval's a little better. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's really just interesting games. There's a lot of tactical kind of intricacy here. Feel free to go through it more. I guess I'm trying. It's difficult to give a full chess opening. It's due in 45 minutes, but yeah, pawn takes c5 is the #1 playable move for white. And then the follow-up moves for black are knight to c6 or e6. And then the thematic concept for white is to hold on to these pawns. On knight to c6, the main line was bishop to b5, pinning this knight and defending the e5 square. E6, bishop to e3, knight to e7. Basically, white is comfortable. There's not really much of an issue here. I think white just holds things together. Bishop takes c6, b takes c6, knight f3. And yeah, white is just calmly better, I think. I don't think there's anything too scary about this. You're up a pawn. Black is going to make efforts to win these pawns, but I think you want to castle early. You want to play b4, and this particular line, this is one of the less challenging lines that the white has to go through. On knight to f5, this is kind of interesting. Bishop to d5 is the play. Castling is not the play. You really need to protect the ongoing piece of this pawn structure, as well as not hang c5. On knight to f5, bishop to d4, knight takes, pawn takes, I guess. Here, this pawn structure, basically a recurring theme is that this pawn structure, c5, e5, d4, is undermined by b6. So, anyways, I hope that gives kind of a good high-level overview of how to play that opening. Strongly recommend pawn takes c5 as it's the main line. You run into two lines, either e6 or knight to c6, and then in either case you play moves like knight to f3, bishop to e3, and successfully protect the pawn. So that's what I'm saying on that topic. I think that's probably your best route. And yeah, definitely keep at it. It's an interesting opening. I play the main line. I don't play the advanced line, so a lot of this theory, is vaguely remembered at best. So yeah. Thank you very much for recommending this game. This particular opening line. Please always feel free to recommend lessons that you're interested in. Basically, there's lessons. There's a lesson ideas channel as well as a game submissions channel. Feel free to send lesson ideas. As well. At this point, you probably can get a lesson idea on the stream quicker than you can get a game on the stream. So just an idea, but feel free to send both games and lesson ideas, and we'll be super happy. I'm super happy to go over them. All right, with those in, let's take a look at the 3 games for this session. All right, I'll pull those up. First game is from TK. This is TK playing Terrapin, who's I think a FIDE master and a simul. We'll take a look. Okay, so TK is playing white here. Terrapin plays c5, knight f3, and this is the O'Kelly attack, O'Kelly variation. We were talking about this a little bit in the Discord today, and I think O'Kelly variation is fine. I don't think there's any problems that come up for black as a result of this. It's frequently transpositionally appropriate. The only thing that I would say about it is if you play d6 instead, you're defending c5 and e5. You're not, basically defending only b5. It's just a single-purpose move is the problem. So, if a6, then defense on b5. That ends up being, that ends up being probably pretty, so, basically this. There's only one thing that a6 does. It controls b5. The advantages of that, it prevents pieces from moving there, and it can potentially support black playing b5. But yeah. So on this variation, white can play d4. I assume that's the main line. Interesting. So on this variation, this is a little surprising to me, to be honest. This is, I guess, an invitation to start the Alapin. But yeah, hey, thanks very much for joining the stream, Jen. How are you doing? So yeah, I think that early c3 is better. d4, pawn takes d4, knight takes d4, and I think here basically transposes into e6, knight c3, and yeah, I mean basically white is comfortable. This is a normal Sicilian opening now. I guess at this point you're calling it the Khan as opposed to the O'Kelly, but yeah, just mainline opening stuff here. Knight to f6, knight to c3, e5. This is kind of interesting. Sort of, I don't know if you start getting called to the Sveshnikov, but yeah. Knight to f3 again, knight to c6, bishop to c4, and basically white's up by about 3/10 of a pawn here. This is pretty comfortable. White's facing off against f7, knight to g5 can be played, and yeah, looks pretty solid for white. Bishop to b4, bishop to d2, castles, queen to e2. Queen to e2 I think is an error. I think basically better in mainline was castles. Queen to e2, the logic behind not playing queen to e2 is that your game isn't fully, basically your king side isn't fully developed yet. Castling before advancing the queen would probably be the default logic for that. Queen to e2, d6, h3, b5, knight to d5. You have to invent one first, Jen. That's the point. You have to invent a line. G4, knight to e7, knight to e3, and basically here black is black is worse. Black is better. This G4 is getting evaluated as an error. That's sort of interesting. I guess I would say that pushing on the king side could be helpful for white. G5, H5, pushing. This basically king side idea is often so strong in the Sicilian. I'm sort of wondering why it's not in particular here. I would figure that that's kind of the main thematic concept of this play. So castles, queen to c7, h4, and yeah, basically white's looking fine. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knight to g5. I think this was also an error. H5. Yeah, I mean basically white's attacking, but black has good opportunities. Letting this e4 pawn get attacked causes big problems. Also here, the bishop is attacking f2, and that never really gets resolved. So, I don't know. Queen to b6. This is weird, because thematically, I really do think that that pushing on the king side is better. So I'm surprised that the eval is not in agreement with that. What is it saying if, basically if not that? The engine seems to be steering play towards the queen side, which is not thematically consistent with what I would expect. But I don't know. I guess the Khan can play out sort of weird, but I don't know. A4 is what the engine is pushing for. Second choice is B4. But let's just look at the engine line. Just what's the engine saying? Because I would probably be playing things like G5, G4 here. B takes, rook takes. Well, send in as many as you want. There's no limit. TK seems to send in one for almost every lecture, which is fine with me, to be honest. So yeah, I guess I would say use your best judgment, but it's not as if we have too many games. So the important thing is just that we have enough games and enough lesson ideas for each stream. But I don't feel particularly strongly about that one. So anyways, I mean, to be honest, I feel like we're sort of moving in the direction of having more and more lessons and fewer games. So I guess I would say feel free. Um, I mean, it's up to you. If you send 10 games at once, I'll just put them on for streams way out in the future probably. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm more focused long term. I'm more focused on making sure that we have lessons because to be fair, lessons are more interesting for people whose game it's not than yeah. I would say no limit. That probably again uh, it kind of loses some utility if you overload it. But at the same point, 45 minutes, half of every lecture is just going to be general material now. So it's not as if you can really break anything. Um, anyways, E4, C5, and basically this O'Kelly variation. Let's take a look at this O'Kelly variation, right? This is interesting. Basically the main moves here. What's particularly interesting to me is that in this case, against the A6 variation, C3 and C4 become the most popular moves. That's surprising because D4, I think let's take a look because I'm sort of curious. But in D6, D4 is the most popular move. Against knight to C6, D4 is the most popular move. Against E6, D4. And against G6, D4. But actually against A6, you really do, there really is a split. It's not, D4 is not the most popular move here. C3 is. And C3, D5, E takes D5, Queen takes D5, D4, Knight F6. This is what the O'Kelly variation generally tends to look like. Bishop to E2, E6, castles, Knight to C6. And yeah, I mean, that is, this basically is a solid way for white to play this. I'm also wondering about C4. The advantage of C4 over D3 is that D5 isn't playable. Hey, thank you very much for the follow, Cordy. I appreciate it. Thanks for being here. So C4, we're looking at basically this O'Kelly theory. So C4 holds this D5 pawn and also, offers the opportunity to take if black attempts B5. So I think this is probably this, basically this I like the most. I didn't know the names of this. C3 is the Venice system. C4 is the Maroczy bind. I think C4 basically is the this Maroczy bind. That makes sense to me. I think I would probably play this. To be fair, I don't really see the O'Kelly variation that often. I don't know why. It's not a bad opening, but I just don't seem to run into it that often. C4 over D4. It seems to be the only second move for black that involves C4 as opposed to D4. And I guess that's probably a result of wanting to preempt B5. That's why I think that C4 is so popular. Also, just having a general Maroczy bind, basically having pawn's defense on D5. This is good for white. D5, E6, knight to C3, queen to C7, bishop to E2. This is very comfortable. No problems here. And ideas, I guess I would say, as black, knight to C6. It's going to be standard developing moves, and white will probably decide to open up this center sooner or later. In this situation, white castles, knight F6, but D4 is eventually coming. D4 is very obviously here, and then you just have a basically a Sicilian game in which A6 has been played, not really doing much, and then you have a you basically have a Maroczy bind formation against black. So that's sort of so that's actually a very interesting instructive point, I think, is that basically against this O'Kelly variation, C3 and C4 are the two most popular moves. Every other second move for black, D4. So D4, knight takes D4, knight to F3. Basically, white's looking fine. There's no real issues. And then the missteps for white come here. What's surprising? It's surprising to me, to be completely honest. I would figure that starting a kingside attack here would be one of white's main kind of thematic points. I would figure that would be a pretty solid idea. But yeah, A4, castles. It's up to it's up to white what to play. But I think G4, knight to E3, knight to F5 here. White's comfortable. So I think that's better. G4 creates some vulnerabilities. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I have a hard time. Honestly, I have a hard time justifying why this is an error. Let's look again. So one of the things that it can do, one of the issues that can occur is with bishop to b7 and bishop facing off against h1. That's probably good for white, but yeah, white is fine. Basically, let's look in this line that's evaluated so well for black. Um, but yeah, so h4, rook e8, h5. This line basically allowed so knight to g5 here, and basically on h6. I don't know. Uh, so yeah, I'm sort of. I just want to play through. We haven't actually played to the end yet, but I'm guessing that black just gets an insurmountable advantage. So yeah, interesting. Um, but the difference here, where were the missteps for white? Opening up this diagonal seemed to cause problems. I have I have difficulty, disliking this move. I think it's thematically correct. Um, uh, Other ideas, I mean, castles, I guess. And let's look at like whether white attacks on the king side after castling situation. Knight to e7, knight to bishop to g5, f6. Basically, white is fine. I think white is fine. I think, but I don't think that king side attack is ever going to materialize. So I guess no. It's a rare situation where a king side attack is kind of underwhelming for white and the Sicilian. These king side attacks are often the thematically correct thing to do. I guess maybe a better strategy for white here may be to attack some of the weak pawns on the queen side. I have really a lot of trouble recommending an anti-thematic Sicilian move, but I think this is the type of situation where you might be able to assemble an attack on d6 and assemble an attack on a6 and b5. I think that might be the way to go. That's certainly what the engine is recommending. But it's hard to know. Basically, it's hard to play anti-thematic moves or anti-thematic ideas, and it's hard to recommend them. In this specific case, I think that that it might be the better play. A4 attacking b5, and then maybe castles kingside and attacks on d6. But it's weird to be doing something other than kingside attacking in the Sicilian. How would you determine that is really the main question. How would you decide which situation is one where which situation is one where it's play on the king side versus play on the queen side. I think a4 is probably better, but yeah, a4 and attacks on b5 and d6 is better in this situation. I guess part of it might be your knight is way better set up to play in the center and to play on the queen side than it is to play on the king side. It's not really going to be able to get onto the king side without a ton of very awkward effort, this d5 knight. So maybe it's just because your pieces are oriented in that direction. Another thing that could be problematic, and another thing that might make you want to lead towards a king side attack, is that castling queen side is awkward here. Basically your king safety is not going to be particularly good with castling queen side. Not because black's pawns are particularly strong or anything, but because this whole side is likely to get liquidated reasonably soon. So that's just something to consider. G4's missed move, knight to e3, and basically after this, black has black has an advantage. Threats on e4 are going to be powerful, and knight to g6 is inaccurate. White actually equalizes here. But again, these moves spent playing on the king side really don't come to anything. With this knight to f4, white has bad choices between queen to f1 or knight takes g4 or or bishop takes f4, and then having a real defensive problem for e4. I know bishop takes and then knight to g4, knight to g5 is a mistake. Much better here, I think queen to d2 or knight to d2. I was looking at knight to d2 first. I think queen to d2 is given a little bit better. Queen to d2 creates counterplay on this d6 pawn. But yeah, either knight to d2 or queen to d2 are much better than the knight to g5. The issue is just that on knight to g5, h6 can be played, and that knight's going to get pushed somewhere awkward, and that e4 pawn's going to fall. So yeah, 2 blunders for white in this game. I don't want to take it much past here because I think that black makes a pretty good win out of this. But yeah, the issue here is this. G4 was not so G4 I feel less bad about. G4 basically, yes, generally yes, Limestone. Yeah, you do want to kind of go all in on the king side. That is a that is a way that you can play it, and it usually is correct. Just play aggressively on the king side, and regardless of where you castle, sometimes you castle king side and attack on the king side even. But yeah, the thematic concept of the Sicilian is generally a white attack on the king side, played quickly and early in the game, and then a longer, more kind of basically a longer battle and route to a win for black on the queen side. So white attacks hard early on the king side, and then if that doesn't work, then black wins slowly by exerting pressure on the queen side. That's usually the thematic concepts behind the Sicilian. In this particular play, there's a few things that are strange. The first thing that's strange is that we determined that the O'Kelly variation involves three c3 or c4. C4 looks the most appealing there, but it doesn't have 3d4, or 3 to d4 is not the preferred line in the O'Kelly variation. That's interesting, an interesting piece. But yeah, so G4, is thematically correct, but not helpful in this particular case. So I can't really fault too much on playing G4. It's hard to see anti-thematic concepts. But yeah, this is not the normal go all in on the Sicilian king side, like Limestone is saying. Knight to f5, knight to g6, and basically this is problematic. What really creates the issue is when you push this attack further. This knight takes this good outpost, and you have 2 choices that are bad. Bishop takes f4, bad choice number 1. Queen f1, bad choice number 2. Bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4, and then this knight on this e4 pawn is in trouble. So queen to d2 or knight to d2 is better, but knight to g5 I think is the most decisive mistake of this game. Black doesn't play it correctly, but on h6, this knight is pushed somewhere awkward. E4 c5, Limestone. But yeah, so h6 and basically h6 and then knight to h3. This ends up being pretty good, I think, for white. But yeah, this ended up being slightly misplayed by black. But I would focus on this kind of fail that it's kind of a fail on the kingside attack. So I would say that that was a mistake there. Knight to d2, queen to d2. Those are better moves for white. Nothing too bad, but this attack peters out pretty quickly, and yeah, that's that's the thing. Anyways, thank you very much for sending the game, TK. Feel free to keep sending them. You send a lot. I can book things way in advance and give better analysis, so feel free. But yeah, thank you very much for sending that, TK. All right, here's one by, I think this is called, I think white sent in this game, so we'll take it from white's perspective. Okay. E4, C5, knight F3, D6, D4, pawn takes, knight takes. And basically this is transferring into the Najdorf variation with knight F6, D6, and A6. Cool. All right, so this is very mainline theory. Bishop E3, E5, knight to F3. On this, aggressive E5 play, knight to F3. Basically, knight to F3 way better than knight to F3. Main line is knight to B3. Interesting. I always play knight to F3, so I'm not super familiar with this the relative popularities here. But yeah, knight to B3 I guess is the main line. But knight F3 is also playable. Let's just look at the engine eval. Knight to F3 up by about 0.1 pawns, something like that. And knight to B3 up by 0.1 pawns. So it's really up to maybe a little better knight to B3. It looks like knight to B3 is about 3 times as popular, but I play knight to F3. So, anyways, knight F3, bishop to E6, bishop to C4. Yeah, castles, knight to C6, queen to E2. Okay, we're in a mainline Sicilian Najdorf for sure. Going back to the game, this early queen to C7, bishop to B3, B5. Let's look how much opening there is. All right, so we're out of the opening theory after queen to C7 pretty much, I think. So queen to C7 I think is not. So bishop to B3, and then the weird move is B5. Okay, so B5 is where black basically deviates and starts playing his own kind of game here, as opposed to just the mainline Sicilian. So B5, I guess better here is queen to E2, bishop to E6, rook FD1, rook C8, and basically, I think white's gonna be pretty solid. Knight to H4 looks like an idea for black. If knight to H4, then knight to D5 could be good. But I think white's pretty comfortable. No real issues. Developing moves, maybe C3, knight to D5. This is the Najdorf. Middle game. So middle game of the Najdorf. No sides have made any errors yet. So again, all looks fine and intuitive. So bishop h4 is given as a mistake. I guess the reason why, so bishop to h4, knight takes e4 is playable. This is kind of a crazy tactic. So let's see, knight takes e4, bishop takes, knight takes, and then pawn takes c3, queen takes e2. So that's the reason. So this offers black a tactical opportunity. So for that reason, bishop to h4 is an error. On bishop to h4, knight takes, bishop takes, and knight to d5, by the way, is slightly better here. Knight takes, and then on bishop takes d8, white would play knight to e2 with check, so black would not lose the queen. So overall, this bishop to h4 allows black the opportunity to win this e4 pawn. The actual engine best line, knight to d5, bishop takes d5. This is kind of interesting, but also bad for white. So bishop takes f6. You can't allow this bishop to fall to this to this undefended pawn. Basically, this discovered attack on this bishop, winning a pawn for black. So that can't be allowed. So that's an error for white. Instead, bishop takes f6 is given as the engine best move. Bishop to c1 could be interesting, but I mean, bishop to c1 doesn't cause the same problems, but bishop takes f6 is the best. Bishop takes f6. So that's your first. So that's your first opportunity. So bishop to h4, I think, is in a move that's worth improvement. G5 is inaccurate. The right move was that knight takes e4 tactic that we were talking about. White is pushing, and white is better. Basically, this knight can be kicked fairly easily with g3 if white wants to go that direction. It can also be challenged with knight to e2 or bishop to e3 even. So, other than that, basically black's primary strength in this position is this white knight on f4. Since that white knight is on f4, that white knight is on f4. So that is the biggest advantage to black in this situation. Bishop to e3 threatens a knight. I think that's overall pretty good. But I think that ends up being kind of basically bishop to e3 threatening that knight on f4. That is a really good way for white to deal with that issue. That's good. G3, pawn takes f4, and is fine here. King to h1 could be good. But yeah, basically black loses his best piece to white's average bishop, basically. H3, and white is fine. Bishop takes looks okay. White is now just, I think, up a pawn, right? I don't think there's any immediate threats on the king side here. And let's just see what happens. So bishop to c8 is an error, allowing knight to d5. Yep, looks good. It wins the d6 pawn, among other things. And yeah, white, I assume, finds a way out of this rook and pawn endgame eventually. All right, there you go. Cool. All right, so white eventually trades off. So this is a win for white. Ultimately good game for white. Thank you very much for showing it, sending it. This bishop to h4 is an error. On bishop to h4, knight takes e4, and then white loses a pawn. Other than that, I think the situation goes pretty quickly in white's direction. The conceptual things made sense. Rook e d1 is not as good as king to f1. Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's pretty nitpicky. Like, I don't know. No human would play king f1 there. King h1 is correct here, by the way. So yeah, I think white played this pretty well. Surprised that the eval is so low. I guess there was some volatility. That pawn, yeah, I guess. But yeah, overall, I think that this is this is good for white. Yeah, so the error was on knight takes e4. This is all theory. Yeah, you played well. I think there's inefficiencies later in this game, but this is the only one that really could have threatened your situation. Bishop to h4, knight takes e4, and things are good for things are basically good for white. Yeah, black never equalizes, and then with knight to d5, you get up by kind of an insurmountable amount. You're now up 3 pawns. You're up, you're up 3 pawns in terms of eval. You're up, 1 pawn, on the board, and black's not gonna have much ability to continue an attack on your king on h1. It'd be really hard to set one up. So, anyways, interesting situation. Thank you very much for sending that game, and yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for that. King to h1 was a good move, and white carries a 3-pawn eval advantage into the endgame. Nicely done. Good game. Thank you very much for sending it. On to the last one of tonight. Let's take a look. This is Fachubio's game. Here it is. Okay, so Fachubio basically plays e4. His opponent plays English, or what do they call it? Owen defense. I forget. English is b6 against d4. Owen is b6 against e4. Okay, Owen defense, sure. knight to f3, bishop to b7, knight to c3, and basically white has a kind of good position. Not the type of position that's kind of an insurmountable win. Not the type of position that things are for sure better, but basically, it's the type of situation where white is controlling the center. Black plays kind of an irrelevant-ish flank opening. When white gets the opportunity to play, basically a big opening game against against a flank opening, he develops a better center and a better space advantage. I'm not a fan of the modern games. It probably doesn't take a whole lot to infer that. But I think that the modern games are kind of an inaccurate way to play. The whole concept of the modern is basically, basically give your opponent, volunteer to give your opponent a big space and big center advantage and hope that they misplay it. But you've still given them an advantage that takes away from equality there. So that's the thing that I think is kind of unusual about it. Basically you're volunteering to give edges to your opponent. So here, Fachubio basically ends up with a big center. The thing is, you have to be very careful and not overextend. Basically black is playing for an overextension by white. I guess what I would say is that this, that this general idea is basically to be carefully establish and maintain a better position. Don't go for some crazy attack. Don't play d5 and basically simplify everything in the center. Just play like bishop to d3, bishop to f4, castles, queen e2, and just very calmly, take the space advantage and center control that black has volunteered for you, and use it to develop your pieces to better squares and end up with the initiative. That's what I would say about that. So yeah, bishop to d3, castles, bishop to f4, all of those moves should be good for white, and basically kind of play a calm, reasonable game against black's passive play. What black wants you to do is to play things like e5, and then black can undermine with like d6, and then white ends up with like an isolated pawn that's overextended on e5. Like that's a very typical type of thing that can happen. So black is basically challenging you to overextend, and if you just play calmly as white and don't over push, you will end up with a better position here. Bishop to b4, bishop to d3, pawn, bishop takes pawn. That trading off black's good squared bishop for this knight is not a good idea. That didn't help black really in any way. So by this point, white is in good shape. White can go for bishop to f4. I'm not a fan of bishop to a3, although it looks kind of appealing here. I think probably bishop to f4, or immediately castles. But the ideas of like castles, bishop to f4, queen to d2, slowly building up a better center, developing your pieces to very healthy squares, and getting ready to push your pawns forward. So castles, c4. This is an error, I think. I think better was e5, I guess. I wouldn't have played e5 either, though. I would have played rook e1. Rook e1 develops a piece. So I would leave the center alone. Engine is recommending e5, but those types of moves are what can get white into trouble here. Maybe it's best. I'll have to think about it. So on e5, h6, I guess, or knight f5. But this pawn's, I guess black is basically the engine is figuring that this pawn structure is strong and maintainable. I always think that moving your pawns to the 5th rank in the modern tends to be risky. Risks overextension. So I like rook to e1 better. But yeah, white is fine. So rook to e1. Okay, sure. c4, d5. But this honestly, this is not really that great for white. Locking this center does block this bishop, but I don't think it successfully stops much here. If you were willing to bite the bullet and play a pawn to e5, the pawn to play to e5 was or if you're going to bite the bullet and play a pawn to the 5th rank, The one to play was e5 and not d5. So this thought, I think, is not the correct theme. You know, you want to basically set up a very strong French type pawn structure. Is the choice, as opposed to like a Benoni pawn structure, basically. Um, so yeah, e5 here. e5 is stronger than the c4 d5 idea. Also quicker, because you get the pawn on e5 immediately. On e5, then knight can go to f5. That doesn't really do much. I'm wondering about the immediate undermining moves, like h6 or that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. So I think that basically, yes, this locked that bishop in, right? So yeah, so I think that's a big piece of it too. E5, and you have this attack on h7. That is, you know, that is more valuable. So getting your pawns onto the opposite, you're making a great point. Getting your pawns onto the opposite color squares of the bishop is also why this structure is better than the d5 structure. You know, on the opposing side, black also gets his fianchettoed bishop, but this attack on h7 is worth it. This pawn structure is sturdy, and basically having it on the opposite colored square of the bishop is going to provide a lasting advantage. So yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up. That is definitely a big point. So yeah, yeah, this is blocked off here. Knight to g4, sure, and yeah, white's I don't know, opportunities here for white. I guess knight to d2 could be good, but yeah, now things are locked up, and this trade wasn't particular. This kind of you know, center blockage wasn't particularly good for white. Let's see if black manages to do anything. Okay, knight f1. Let's figure out the tactical mistake. Knight f1 hangs the e4 pawn. Okay, so basically this is a pretty straightforward error. Better, I guess, was like h4, h5, or f3 potentially, or bishop to b2. There were better moves there. So yeah, so that pressure on e4, that ended up being, or basically hanging e4 like that was an error. After knight takes e4, white is up by about, or black is up by about 3 pawns. Black misses it, but I bet he sees it eventually. Or maybe not. Okay. So now, in this situation, bishop to f3 is the resource for white. This is all tactical play. I'm just sort of reading off of the engine input here. This isn't really much value add for me. So bishop to f3, bishop to f2 is the idea here. That is you know, a way that white can simplify and then make his situation a little bit less vulnerable. So here, queen to d7, knight to e3, but basically trade off pieces, and basically if you can get the knight to f5, that could be helpful for white here. So yeah, let's go back. So this was conceptually an error, right? I mean, you know, putting the pawns on a lasting, basically putting the pawns in a lasting way in front of your d3 pawn is problematic. You know, it's also a healthier looking pawn structure. But yeah, you're making a really good point. The pawns are on the opposite colored squares as the bishop. Bishop's facing in towards h7, and white is you know, white is good after this. So c4, d5, and yeah, white's fine. So yeah, so I think that was the first thing to reconsider. E5 was an improvement over the c4 d5 idea. Here, basically, now you have this attack on h7. Black will come up with good solutions to that, but that bishop on the opposite colored squares is a good idea, good plan. So this happens now. The white squared bishop is sort of blocked in. Yeah. Putting pressure. I mean, White's basically making the best attempts here, but I think this game is pretty much over after the king side gets open. So, anyways, interesting. And yeah, so yeah, looking back, where are the where are the opportunities for improvement? Um, I think all of this was fine. This was all a reasonable play. Better was e5, but I wouldn't have even played e5. I probably would have played rook e1. Just keep the center together, keep it all together, and basically make black sort of challenge you. Black might try something like d5, then you obviously play e5. Black might try something like c5, but then you can kind of let it be and basically wait for the pawn to take on d4. But white should be better here. So yeah, this ends up being good for white, and yeah. Sorry, this ends up being good for black after this whole center got blocked off. Um, I don't know. I don't think there's really all that much, to be honest. Bishop, or sorry, knight. So three. I guess three main pieces here. Thematically, getting this pawn structure to give you this threat on h7. This is a better pawn move than was played. I would have played rook e1, kept the solid center, but that's not as good as the engine suggests. On further on this, there was a big error where a pawn gets hung here. So after bishop to e2 and knight to f1, this just hangs e4. So that's just a tactical miss. Tactic study. That's the solution to that one. So yeah, knight to f1 and that f3 and basically that e4 pawn hangs. So that was big, big piece of this. After bishop to h5, knight takes h5, queen takes h5, f5, and I just want to go through this line. Basically, things are rapidly opening up on this king. The engine sees this all the way through to a 2.5 point lead, but yeah, the position is clearly getting dangerous. So overall, three pieces there. The pawn structure moving to e5, basically making the pawn structure look like a French as opposed to a Benoni. This was better. It was better in general because it's a sturdier pawn structure, and it was in general, it was better specifically relating to your pieces because it didn't block in this bishop. Going the other way blocked in your opponent's bishop, but it really blocks in your bishop, and your opponent's bishop can escape with bishop c8, bishop h3. So that's a big thing there. So yeah, e5 is better than c4 here, or c4 the d5 plan. And then after that, there was a hung pawn. I don't think there's much there except just kind of a focused consideration. Knight to f1, knight takes e4, and then this plan opens up. White's kingside too much. Better, I think, was so on minus 1.15. Yeah, I mean, this ends up being good for black. Getting all this pawn structure open, good for black. So, anyways, that was the biggest takeaway. In terms of the biggest positional improvement, that pawn structure, pawn center thing is something to consider. Consider the relative values of your bishop when you're choosing to lock up the center so permanently. Your bishop basically got permanently cut out of the game. I'm not even convinced that d5 hurt his bishop more than it hurt your bishop, to be completely honest. You spend about 2 moves playing c4 and d5, and his bishop can escape on c8, and your bishop can't really escape that well on e2. So I think that from a conceptual perspective is probably the thing to think about the most. The rest is mainly just tactical stuff and kind of the speed at which black can break into white's kingside. But I would say it hurt both of his bishops. Yeah, we can take a look. It hurt both of the light squared bishops for sure. Did it hurt the dark squared bishop? I mean, not really. I guess it locks up the center. I mean, it hurts the bishop. It hurts both of the bishops on the board in the sense that it's closing the position and making and it basically making the position more closed. But yeah, it weakens the bishop in general. Basically, black only has one bishop weakened, and white has two bishops weakened. So that's how it weakens the this bishop. In terms of going to d5, if the alternative move is e5, yeah, maybe bishop to a3, maybe bishop to g5. But yeah, this ends up being yeah, this probably is better. It does hurt both bishops. I think that keeping this keeping the position more open in general is beneficial to both of the bishops versus the knights. Making it more closed helps out black's minor pieces. So, anyways, interesting situation, and yeah, e5 over d5 was the main improvement. So, anyways, thank you very much for sending the game, Fatubio. Thank you very much, everyone, for sending in games. And please, yeah, please keep sending games. I'm very interested in hearing what you guys have to say, and it's really helpful for me. I learn a lot from these analysis, so yeah, thank you very much for sending everything. Thank you all for being here. Next stream is at 8 a.m. Eastern tomorrow morning, in about 9 hours or so. And yeah, thank you very much for joining the stream. I really appreciate it. Everyone have a good night, and thank you for being here. Thanks. Bye.